And now on the line is ecologist and professor at Trinity College, Jane Stout. Jane, welcome to the programme.
Hello.
Okay, Jane, good morning. We're talking on radio today to talk about the UN report that came out last week that said that 1 million species are at risk of extinction, and we're also going to focus as well on what can be done to stop this. To start off, for the benefit of some of our listeners who perhaps don't know a lot about the report that was issued last week, could you give us a bit of a summary of the report?
Yeah, sure. So this was a global assessment that was released by an international organisation called IPBES, and what this is it's the equivalent of the IPCC, which sets out these reports on climate change. So it provides the scientific evidence that can inform governments and decision makers. And so whereas the IPCC reports refer to climate change, this report refers to biodiversity and ecosystems. And what it is a global assessment of the state of the world's biodiversity and ecosystems, the threats to biodiversity and ecosystems, and also the benefits that we get from them. Some of the headlines from the reports in terms of the state of biodiversity are quite shocking. So in terms of, 1 million species at risk of extinction, as you mentioned there, quite stark headlines, shocking to some, but I think for us working in the community, not that surprising. I suppose the significance of the report is that it is an equivalent to the IPCC in that it has been asked for by government and signed off by all of these governments around the world. So it's putting the fate of biodiversity and ecosystems at the top of the agenda. Okay. And I think that's what's really significant about it.
Okay, we'll talk about Ireland a bit more in a couple of minutes, but could you first of all tell us why it is so important in Ireland and around the world that we restore a lot of biodiversity areas?
Well, biodiversity is it just means the variety of life, and this variety of life interacts with each other and forms ecosystems. Biodiversity and ecosystems are basically our life support systems. So this is the ecosystems and the functioning and processes that happen in ecosystems provide us with food, with fuel, with clean water, also provides regulation of climate, the formation and maintenance of soils, pollination services. So these really, really important natural processes that are fundamental to human life, to our existence, but also in terms of benefiting the quality of our life and improving human well-being. So it's recognised that biodiversity and ecosystems, or if it's easier, just think about it as nature, that nature is fundamental to us. We know that, but also it improves our well-being. So a loss of nature and a loss of these processes and functions from natural ecosystems can damage our well-being, but also can damage our societies and what we're doing, and it's compounding the impacts of climate change, whereby nature can actually be a solution to climate change. But if we're losing nature, then we haven't got that option. So it's really, really fundamentally important, and I think it's been largely ignored. And you step outside your front door and you do see nature, so you kind of think, is it really being lost? So the loss of nature has largely been ignored because we've traditionally seen it as this infinite resource that it regenerates itself. So surely it's always going to be there. But if our rate of exploiting it or using it up or damaging it exceeds the rate at which it can replenish, then, we've got a problem because it diminishes, and then it can no longer provide us with these life supports.
To talk a bit about Ireland, this is something that really hits me. Like, Ireland has one of the lowest levels of forest cover. I think it's the lowest level of forest cover in Europe and in the world, and one of them in the world, I think. This is unbelievable, isn't it?
The level of forest cover in Ireland is the lowest in Europe. It's improving. There has been programmes in place to increase forest cover in Ireland, and we can see, that has been happening. But I think the thing about forest cover is it needs to be the right sorts of forests in the right sorts of places. So in terms of restoring forest cover, it's not as simple as, just let's go out and plant lots of trees, because they need to be planted in the right places.
When you were on Morning Ireland on Tuesday, as we were saying, Pádraig Fogarty from the Irish Wildlife Trust was also on it. He was talking about there's a TD in the Dáil, or it could be a senator, who actually has a bill before the Houses of the Oireachtas at the moment that he seeks to increase the use of using bogs. Is that true? Is it?
Yeah, that was what Pádraig said the other day. I think bogs are something that's, it's a particularly Irish issue. So in an international context, we've got these amazing habitats that are quite rare internationally. We maybe take them for granted here, and traditionally we've used them for hundreds of years. And so there are conflicts between using bogs and traditional use of bogs and restoring bogs because of the biodiversity, the habitats they create, but also because they hold in a lot of carbon and carbon sinks. In terms of peat-fired power stations, that's something that can't really continue. We can't continue to commercially exploit bogs and burn peat. We need to move to a non-carbon-based fuel system. And I think increasing exploitation of bogs is something that we've really got to address. We can't do that anymore.
Okay, we've talked a bit about forestry and about bogs. Do you want to maybe say something about the sea, the ocean, and Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, as an island nation surrounded by sea, we've got that's quite an amazing resource, but it's also a big responsibility. And I think in terms of creating marine protected areas, I mean, this isn't my area of expertise at all, but it's the same principle. Is we need to restore and protect our marine areas, and also cease the very damaging ways in which we are exploiting marine resources. So I think Pádraig was speaking the other morning about bottom dredging. That's a very damaging activity. So the way that we're using marine resources and the exploitation of the marine and the non-target impacts that we have. So, we might be fishing for a particular species, but then damaging the habitat for a whole bunch of other species as well at the same time. We just need to change the way that we are managing our oceans and our marine resources.
Are there any other areas as regards nature that we haven't covered?
I suppose one of the key issues that was highlighted by the assessment report that was published on Monday was about the drivers of biodiversity loss, and one of the key drivers has been the intensification of agriculture, associated loss of habitats and increased pollution, and so the way that we are using the land for agriculture at the moment is unsustainable. So that's also something that we need to make changes. We need to intensify in terms of our ecological intensification, and think about the other benefits that we get from agricultural land, not just the food that we take from it.
Could you tell us a bit about your view of the Wildlife Act and any other legislation in Ireland that is supposed to address these matters?
Yeah, so I mean, we do have in Europe, we do have quite good legislation for wildlife. So in terms of the Habitats Directive, which is an EU directive, Birds Directive, the Water Framework Directive. So we have all these international directives. We have national level policies, the Wildlife Act. We have sustainable pesticide use, etc. What needs to happen is that these environmental acts need to not be in conflict with one another, and also need to be well implemented and enforced. So I think the issues with our Wildlife Protection Act is that they need to protect wildlife, and they need to be appropriately managed in order to do that.
Pádraig from the Irish Wildlife Trust spoke a couple of times on Tuesday on Morning Ireland about the importance and value of the UN Sustainable Development Goals in solving climate change and the loss of biodiversity. Do you agree with him on that?
Absolutely. So the Sustainable Development Goals, actually the Global Assessment Report that was published on Monday suggested that the loss of biodiversity and ecosystems would undermine our ability to deliver 80% of those goals. So in terms of sustainable development, in terms of future generations, in terms of human well-being, we can't deliver those goals. We can't deliver those sustainable goals by 2030 if we carry on with the current trajectory of biodiversity and ecosystem loss. And goals around climate mitigation, you know, as I said before, with the bogs, with forests, they are a solution to climate change, as well as in that they can help to capture carbon, which is what we need in order to meet our climate change goals. Is we need to be pulling carbon back out of the atmosphere. So I think the loss of biodiversity, the risks of climate change, the Sustainable Development Goals, it's all part of the same process. And I think if we can get our environmental management right, we can start to solve things about climate change. We can start to restore biodiversity and habitats, and we can start to meet those sustainable development goals.
I think it's remarkable that Ireland has a reputation to a lot of people around the world as being like the Emerald Isle, a green country, you know, and we have the lowest level of forest cover in Europe. It's unbelievable, I think, you know.
Well, we are. I mean, we are a very green country. You know, if you're in an airplane flying over Ireland, it's very green. But yes, it's very often a green desert. You know, empty fields, as you say. A very intensively managed pasture has very little biodiversity in it. It's, you know, maybe one or two species of grass or herbs. But yeah, and that's the kind of thing that we need to be moving away from, and actually trying to increase diversity, both, you know, within an individual field, but at a landscape level. Having that diversity in the landscape, lots of different types of habitats, then provides homes for lots of different creatures and also delivers lots of different benefits to humanity.
We have National Biodiversity Week coming up in Ireland, and I was reading on Twitter yesterday, we also have a National Biodiversity Action Plan. Do you want to just say something about them?
Okay, so yeah, the National Biodiversity Action Plan runs from 2017 to 2020. I think it's the third National Biodiversity Action Plan. And if we were to deliver on the National Biodiversity Action Plan, then we really would make a difference. And just the other day, there was, I saw this on Twitter, the Minister for Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht announced that now public bodies are going to be required to report on how they are delivering the National Biodiversity Action Plan. And the objectives of the plan are to bring biodiversity into the mainstream, so make sure that biodiversity is considered in decision-making across all sectors, to strengthen the knowledge base for conservation, to increase the awareness and appreciation of biodiversity, and to actually conserve and restore biodiversity and ecosystems in the wider countryside, in the marine, and to improve and expand our protected areas. So there are some really sensible objectives, targets and mechanisms to reach them in the National Biodiversity Action Plan. And yes, we should be implementing that. Everybody should look at that, and we should be implementing it. And
Biodiversity Week, I only heard of it recently. That's kind of like raising awareness, I presume, is it?
Yeah, so there's an International Day of Biodiversity. There's an International Bee Day. Bees are the things that I study, so that's on May 20th. There's a whole series of international events, and that's been going for a few years now. And this year, there's National Biodiversity Week in Ireland, which starts on Saturday the 18th of May and runs through that following week. So there's information on their website about events and things that are going on. And yeah, it's about raising awareness. And I think coming, shortly after the publication of the assessment the other day, the National conference we held for biodiversity earlier this year, all of it's raising the profile for the importance of biodiversity. Biodiversity isn't just a nice to have in the countryside. It's fundamental to all of us, whether we're living in cities, whether we're farmers, whether we're fishermen. It's important to everybody that we have biodiversity and intact ecosystems. And so National Biodiversity Week is a way to raise that awareness and get involved in local events.
Okay, to come towards the end of the interview, Jane, as well as listening to interviews like the one we're doing this morning, what else would you recommend to our listeners on radio that they can do on a local and national level to try to restore a lot of our nature or biodiversity areas?
A lot of restoration of biodiversity is actually quite straightforward. It's more doing less. So things like trying to allow biodiversity to exist in our gardens, in our places of work. We've spent many years trying to sterilise nature, trying to fertilise our lawns and mow them so that there's only one kind of grass in them, eradicating weeds, eradicating pests. These are plants and insects that are part of our biodiversity. So I think my advice would be do less, learn to appreciate nature and what it's doing for us and how fundamental it is to us.